Alex, welcome to the program. The signs are all there in black and white. When will people open their eyes? We don't just have to look at the UK. We can look at Germany, France, European country after European country, seeing prices soar and reliability plummet.
Yeah, that's right, Rita. And look, you're absolutely correct. This seems to be the prevailing situation in the western part of Europe now. And of course, it's all being blamed on Putin. But the reality actually is that although the war in Ukraine hasn't been helpful, it's all been preordained prior to that with this ridiculous push into renewables. I myself, I've always been a great advocate for nuclear power being investigated, even spoke about it in my maiden speech, and I was told every single time, Germany, they're getting rid of all of their nuclear power stations, don't be such a heathen knuckle dragger. And here we are. I mean, I think for those of us that are very much against the concept of net zero, which I think is nothing but a sort of a green carpetbagging scam, we've been saying this for a long period of time. It's really bad that it has to get to this for people to wake up, but I hope slowly the population are starting to understand what this really means.
It's going to be a dark, cold winter in Europe, and people are going to really suffer. We're going to see the outcome of this green lunacy this coming winter in Europe. Now to another trigger-happy waste of money from Labor. Queensland's COVID-19 quarantine camp. It was meant to have 500 beds up and running by the end of 2021, another 500 sometime this year. But now the federal and state governments are at odds over whether Brisbane's COVID-19 quarantine camp is even ready for use. What's going on here? Because this is costing $200 million. And do we even need these facilities anymore, Alex? The Palaszczuk government seems determined to deliver it, but when?
Yeah, it's been the great mystery. I mean, these have been rolled out all across the country. Of course, we've had a few here in South Australia, and it seemed like the governments were across the country, the state governments were just falling over themselves to build these things for what we'd all hoped would be a very short need cycle, if at all. I mean, I don't know why we needed them full stop, but this is almost like building an Olympic village without Olympic Games. It's such a terrible, crying waste of resources, particularly in a time where those resources are so precious and scarce. And, you do have to wonder, is there something we're not being told here? I mean, why are these projects still going ahead? Why would they go ahead in the first place? And, I just wonder. I wonder whether or not, we are being, led down the garden path for using these more than we should, more than we would want to in future so-called pandemics. Let's see. But I think it's a great mystery, and I'm at an absolute loss.
Well, let's move to the US now. This really hate-filled speech by Joe Biden. Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. One moment he's slamming social media for spreading misinformation. The next he's putting pressure on them to suppress free speech on COVID-19, conspiring with the very same companies he's criticising. This has all been revealed by the new Civil Liberties Alliance, showing that officials from the CDC, the White House and other federal bureaucrats invited all tech platforms to a reoccurring meeting between government agencies and private industry to discuss information sharing around election risks, briefs from the industry, threat updates and other things to look out for. Alex, there's so much to cover there, but also what we saw today from Joe Biden, that was a dangerous speech, so divisive and so ugly, painting half the country as, domestic terrorist almost.
Yeah, and I saw it reported today on Twitter that he mentioned the Republicans 16 times, he mentioned January 6th 5 times, and yet the border crisis, fentanyl, high prices all didn't get a single mention. It says everything you need to know about that speech, and the imagery was so appalling. Look, I think this whole business about social media and where it's headed and how it's being used, particularly by the Democrats, the left of politics in the United States and here, of course, is really, really troubling. I moved last year for a Senate Select Committee inquiry in relation to how big tech is influencing our democracy, and it got shot down by one vote. Jackie Lambie didn't vote for it. I think this is a preeminent issue of our time. Even the former Twitter boss, Jack Dorsey, called Twitter the public town square. What they do and the control that they've got over our world is frightening. And to hear that news, that, by the way, comes on the back of that Joe Rogan podcast with Mark Zuckerberg, where he talked about being lent on by the FBI to shut down that Hunter Biden laptop story. I mean, this is outrageous.
It is terrifying, the control these big media or big tech players have in suppressing free speech. And even a big media player like New York Post basically having a bombshell story disappeared before the 2020 election. Now let's have a look at what's happening in China with their COVID zero craziness. They're not letting go of this. Have a look.
谢谢。谢谢。谢谢。
Alex, that vision is from a quarantine facility in the eastern Chinese province of Shandong. I mean, people are being treated like lab monkeys there, being thrown bananas, and China's also shut down the entire city of Chengdu. That's 21 million people, all in a bid to stamp out the latest COVID outbreak. We all followed, just about most of the Western world followed China in locking down cities, in trying to eradicate COVID. And we're now seeing just how foolish those policies are, and China's still implementing them.
Yep, and it shows very clearly what this was all about. And frankly, I think what we've seen here is our bureaucrats got suckered, our politicians got suckered, and this COVID zero strategy of lockdowns and control really is exactly that. It's about control. It's about making sure that your population do what you want. And I tell you, the frightening thing I saw in the last 2 years was Australians lapping it up. Never again, Rita.
Well, yeah, and that was what was most disappointing. I mean, it's one thing to have the bureaucrats and the politicians behaving a certain way, but the number of our fellow citizens who seem to cheer on the illiberal policies and seeing their neighbours locked down and confined to curfews and every other indignity we had inflicted on us, particularly down here in Melbourne. Senator Alex Antic, thank you so much for joining me tonight.